There is an error made by almost every chronicler who has attempted to record the destruction of Skoldvidar, and I have allowed that error to survive longer than I should have. They write of the dead descending upon the northern kingdom as though death arrived suddenly from beyond its borders and found an unsuspecting people still standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the banners of their ancestors. They speak of shattered gates, burning halls, blood upon the snow, and the final stand of King Ingvar Hafsson. And because these things are easily understood, they have mistaken them for the cause of what followed. Men have always preferred an enemy that can be given a face. It comforts them to believe that kingdoms are destroyed by swords, that civilizations end when walls are breached, and that catastrophe can be prevented merely by building stronger fortresses and gathering larger armies. I have watched long enough to know otherwise. Skoldvidar was not destroyed when the undead crossed its borders. By then, the kingdom had already suffered the wound from which it would never recover. The dead merely discovered it bleeding. Before the marriage of Ingvar Hafsson and Hestia, Skoldvidar possessed something more valuable than stone walls, iron weapons, or the extraordinary strength of the first humans who inhabited its mountains. It possessed certainty. The people trusted their king. The clans trusted one another, and the warriors standing within the shield wall knew that the warrior beside them would remain there when the enemy came. Such certainty had been forged over generations among a people for whom survival itself demanded unity. The fjords were merciless, the winters long, the mountains filled with dangers that cared nothing for lineage or pride. And so the first humans had learned that no warrior, however mighty, survived alone. Ingvar understood this better than most kings. His greatness had never rested solely upon the strength of his arm. There were stronger creatures in the old world, and there were warriors whose names inspired greater terror. Ingvar's true strength was that when he called, his people answered. When he stood before them, men who had been frightened remembered that they belonged to something larger than themselves. He did not merely command Skoldvidar. For many years, he was the certainty upon which Skoldvidar rested. Then came the marriage, and with it came a question that should have been answered before it was allowed to become 1,000 questions. Hestia was not of the blood of the first humans. She was not Vrykul, as later generations would call them, nor had she been born beneath the ancient mountains whose people guarded their lineage with the same ferocity with which they guarded their borders. To some, that difference meant little. To others, it meant everything. The marriage might have remained a matter of court and household had it not taken place beneath circumstances that allowed resentment to gather around it, and had Queen Renoria Proud not stood so close to the matter that every faction could place some portion of its anger upon her. Those who believed Hestia had been forced into the union looked toward Renoria and asked why a queen with armies at her command had not prevented it. They had expected her to oppose Ingvar, to intervene, perhaps even to threaten the alliance, rather than permit a marriage they considered unjust. When she did not, disappointment became accusation, and accusation soon hardened into hatred. They began to whisper that Renoria had abandoned Hestia for politics, that the proud queen valued alliance more than honor, and that perhaps everything she had spoken of friendship between their peoples had merely been another form of convenience. Yet the hatred did not move in one direction. Among Ingvar's own people, there were those who regarded the marriage as an insult to everything Skoldvidar had preserved through the ages. Their king, born of the first humans and entrusted with the inheritance of their ancestors, had taken a woman outside their race as his wife. Some called it weakness, others contamination, and still others betrayal. Men who had followed Ingvar into battles without questioning where he led them now questioned whether he remained worthy to lead them at all. Old clan grievances returned beneath new names. Priests argued with warriors, fathers argued with sons, and commanders discovered that the men beneath them no longer agreed upon what loyalty required. Ingvar had not become weaker, nor had his courage diminished. Yet courage cannot command men who have first decided that obedience itself is dishonorable. Thus, the same marriage produced two opposing accusations. One side despised Renoria because she had not stood against Ingvar, while another despised Ingvar because he had married Hestia at all. Between those accusations stood thousands who wished only to survive the quarrel, and it was among those thousands that doubt found its richest soil. What followed did not resemble the beginning of a kingdom's destruction, which is precisely why so few understood what they were witnessing. There was no trumpet announcing the arrival of treason, no black cloud gathering above the capital, and no single morning upon which Skoldvidar awoke divided. Instead, conversations became shorter. Men who had once shared drink around the same fires began choosing different benches. A soldier heard another insult Renoria and wondered whether he could trust him in battle. Another heard a companion defend Hestia and wondered whether the traditions of his ancestors meant anything to the man who would someday guard his children. Commanders discovered that every order concerning the alliance was interpreted as proof that they had chosen a side. The armies that had come beneath Renoria's banners were infected by the same uncertainty. Some of her soldiers believed their queen had compromised herself by refusing to oppose the marriage, while others grew weary of defending a northern kingdom whose inhabitants increasingly regarded them as intruders. The division therefore did not separate Skoldvidar from Renoria's host. It passed through both armies, cutting friendships, loyalties, and commands into smaller and smaller pieces, until men who had once expected to fight beside one another began wondering whether they should fight beside one another at all. Then, people began to leave. I remember those departures more clearly than I remember much of the battle that followed, because the battle was only the consequence of what those wagons already foretold. Families abandoned homes their ancestors had inhabited for generations. Warriors removed the tokens of their clans from halls in which they no longer felt welcome. Some of Renoria's soldiers marched away believing that remaining would make them accomplices to something they opposed. Some of Ingvar's warriors returned to distant settlements because they would not defend a king whose marriage they considered a betrayal of their blood. Others departed because they feared what the dispute was becoming, and fear requires no ideology. One household leaving convinced another that perhaps departure was wise. One veteran abandoning his oath caused 10 younger warriors to wonder what he knew that they did not. Each empty house became evidence for the frightened, each missing shield another reason for the next man to question whether he should remain, until departure itself became contagious. Skoldvidar had not lost a battle, yet its strength was already marching away along mountain roads. This is the nature of doubt that mortals most often fail to understand. Doubt does not need to persuade a man that something is true. It needs only to prevent him from being certain that it is false. A soldier need not believe his commander has betrayed him. He need only wonder whether betrayal is possible. A friend need not believe his companion intends to abandon him. He need only consider what he will do if abandonment comes. Once that question has entered his mind, he begins preparing for the betrayal before it happens. He withholds trust, conceals intentions, and watches the man beside him more carefully than he watches the enemy ahead. The companion notices this suspicion and becomes suspicious in return, and thus 2 loyal men may create the betrayal they feared without either ever intending it. I watched this happen across Skoldvidar until a kingdom famous for the unity of its warriors became a kingdom in which every banner seemed to be measuring the distance between itself and the next. The undead arrived only after doubt had accomplished this work. Had they come earlier, they would have encountered the Skoldvidar that generations of enemies had feared. First humans, filling the mountain passes, Renoria's soldiers standing beside them. Clans answering the king's summons without asking what faction the messenger favored, and warriors who knew that if they fell, there would be another shield immediately behind their own. Instead, the dead found abandoned settlements, diminished companies, commanders uncertain which orders would be obeyed, and 2 armies that had begun regarding one another through the memory of an argument rather than the necessity of survival. The enemy did not create these weaknesses. It merely recognized them. Death has always been skilled at entering through doors the living have opened for it. Ingvar called his people nonetheless. Of all that I witnessed during those final days, this is the memory that prevents me from judging him as simply as later historians have done. He knew what had happened, He had watched warriors who once shouted his name leave his halls without farewell. He had heard the accusations concerning his wife, his blood, and his judgment, and he knew that men who had once regarded him as the embodiment of Skoldvidar now spoke of him as though he were the architect of its ruin. Yet, when the dead came, he did not abandon those who had doubted him. He did not demand apologies before raising his weapon, nor did he declare that those who had questioned his honor deserved whatever waited beyond the walls. He summoned what remained, gathered the broken strength of his kingdom, and went to meet the enemy as its king. There was something terrible in that loyalty, for Ingvar remained faithful to the idea of Skoldvidar after Skoldvidar itself had ceased to agree upon what that idea meant. The songs claim that Ingvar Hafsson died beneath the weapons of the undead, and in the narrowest sense, the songs speak truth. His body was wounded in battle, his strength failed, and death took him among the ruins of the kingdom he had tried to preserve. Yet I was there, in the manner that watchers are present at such endings, and I will not permit the final weapon that pierced him to receive credit for a death prepared by countless smaller wounds. Ingvar died because too many shields were absent from the wall. Those shields were absent because warriors had departed. Warriors had departed because trust had collapsed. Trust had collapsed because the marriage divided those who should have stood together, until hatred of Renoria, hatred of Ingvar, fear for Hestia, pride of blood, resentment of outsiders, and suspicion of allies became more important than the enemy gathering beyond their borders. The undead killed the body of King Ingvar Hafsson, but doubt arranged the battlefield upon which his body could be killed. That truth matters because death did not leave Ingvar unchanged. His corpse was taken and raised, as so many noble corpses were taken in those years. But what returned was not merely a dead king forced to serve another master. Corruption has laws, though mortals seldom live long enough to recognize their patterns. And one of those laws is that death remembers the manner in which a soul was broken. There are men who die in hatred and return filled with hatred. There are those who die consumed by hunger and awaken unable ever to be filled. Ingvar entered death carrying the collapse of everything upon which his identity had rested. In life, his strength had been the certainty he inspired in others. His people had looked upon him and remembered that they were one people, one shield wall, one kingdom. Yet his final days had been spent watching that certainty rot around him until every loyalty became a question. When corruption reached into what remained of Ingvar Hafsson, it found doubt already waiting there. Thus, the most terrible irony of Skoldvidar was completed. What had been Ingvar's destruction became his strength. Doubt became his corruption, not as some shallow madness that caused the dead king himself to hesitate, but as a power through which he inflicted upon others the very wound that had destroyed him. The living Ingvar had united men merely by standing among them. The dead Ingvar divides them by the same presence. Around him, confidence becomes fragile. Soldiers who have trusted their captains through years of war begin wondering whether they are being sacrificed for another man's ambition. Friends remember old insults they had long ago forgiven, and suddenly question whether those insults revealed something they should have recognized sooner. A warrior glances toward the man beside him and wonders why that man's breathing has changed, why his hand remains so close to his weapon, why he looked toward the road behind them a moment ago. None of these thoughts need be planted as commands. Ingvar's corruption requires only the smallest uncertainty, because doubt, once awakened, is capable of feeding itself. This is why those who imagine the fallen king of Skoldvidar as merely another undead warlord misunderstand the danger entirely. A stronger warrior may be opposed by greater strength, and a sorcerer may be answered with wards, but an army cannot easily defend itself against the erosion of the trust that makes it an army. Ingvar does not need to break the shield wall with his weapon if he can make the warriors within it wonder whether the shields beside them will remain. He does not need to assassinate a commander if he can make that commander's soldiers question why they were ordered into danger. He does not need to turn brother against brother through enchantment when memory, resentment, and fear can accomplish the same task once certainty has been weakened. The corruption is powerful precisely because its victims believe the thoughts belong entirely to themselves. Perhaps some of them do. Doubt has never required lies when truth can be made uncertain. There is another cruelty in this transformation that deserves preservation. Ingvar once represented the answer to fear. His people could look toward their king during a terrible hour and know where they stood. After his resurrection, he became the question itself. The closer one comes to the thing wearing Ingvar Hafsson's dead flesh, the more difficult certainty becomes, until a company of loyal soldiers may enter his presence united and leave it wondering which among them will be the first to betray the others. In this manner, the fallen king carries the final days of Skoldvidar with him. Wherever he walks, the kingdom falls again in miniature. The same invisible fracture passes from warrior to warrior. The same suspicions gather around leaders. The same instinct towards self-preservation begins disguising itself as wisdom, and eventually, someone decides that leaving before the battle is preferable to discovering too late that everyone else intended to leave as well. I have therefore written beside Ingvar Hafsson's name a warning I have written beside very few of the corrupted dead. Do not measure him by the number of men he can kill. Count instead the number he can persuade not to stand together. A warrior slain by Ingvar is one warrior lost, but a warrior made doubtful may take an entire company with him. He may spread suspicion through a camp, accuse an innocent commander, abandon a position, or convince frightened companions that retreat is the only rational choice. By the time Ingvar raises his weapon, the true battle may already have been fought within the minds of those facing him. Skoldvidar itself is proof enough of the principle. The kingdom possessed warriors capable of facing horrors that would have broken lesser peoples. Yet when the final enemy arrived, those warriors had already spent too much of their strength deciding whom among the living they hated more. For this reason, I reject the histories that name the undead as the sole destroyers of Skoldvidar. They conquered it, certainly, and they filled its halls with death. But conquest and destruction are not always the same event. Skoldvidar began dying when its people ceased granting one another the trust necessary for the kingdom to exist. The marriage of Ingvar and Hestia became the wound around which every old fear and prejudice gathered. Renoria's refusal to stand against the union was interpreted as betrayal by those who believed Hestia had been forced into it. Ingvar's acceptance of a wife outside the blood of the first humans was interpreted as betrayal by those who believed their king belonged first to ancestry and tradition. Between those two convictions stood countless people who were forced to choose sides in a quarrel that should never have become greater than the survival of the kingdom itself. By the time the dead appeared, too many had already chosen departure. Perhaps this is why I remember the empty places more clearly than the corpses. Corpses tell only what happened at the end. An empty place tells what might have stood there. I remember spaces within Ingvar's ranks where warriors should have been, abandoned hearths in settlements that should have sent sons and daughters to the defense, and roads carrying people away from Skoldvidar while enemies gathered beyond the mountains. I remember men looking over their shoulders at allies when they should have been watching the horizon. I remember commanders wasting precious hours determining which clans would answer them. Most of all, I remember Ingvar standing at the center of what remained, still attempting to make one kingdom out of people who had already divided themselves into accusations. If there is justice anywhere in what followed, I have not found it. There is only symmetry. And time is often mistaken for justice because both eventually reveal what men would prefer to forget. Ingvar's strength in life was unity, and therefore his corruption in death became division. His strength in life was certainty, and therefore his strength in death became doubt. He died because doubt emptied his kingdom before the enemy arrived, and when he rose again, he carried that same doubt as other dead kings might carry a sword. The force that destroyed him became the force through which he destroys others. Every army that faces him is offered the same test. Skoldvidar failed, and every soldier who begins to question the loyalty of the person beside him takes one step into the grave that swallowed Ingvar's kingdom. Those who someday confront the fallen king should therefore remember that the first battle will not begin when Ingvar draws his weapon. it will begin much earlier. Perhaps when one soldier wonders why another was chosen for command, when an old grievance is spoken aloud around a fire, or when someone asks whether retreat might be wiser while there is still time. They must understand that trust will be more valuable than courage in his presence, because courage without trust produces only isolated heroes who die separately. Ingvar was once the king who taught Skoldvidar to stand as one. The corruption wearing his body now teaches armies to stand alone, and an army whose warriors stand alone is already a collection of corpses waiting for death to learn their names. Let later historians write of the undead host if they wish. Let them record the numbers of the fallen, the roads by which the enemy approached, the halls that burned, and the place where King Ingvar Hafsson finally died. Such details have value, but they are not the lesson I preserve here. I watched a kingdom strong enough to resist armies become too weak to resist a question. I watched suspicion accomplish what siege engines could not. I watched blood, ancestry, loyalty, pride, and wounded honor become weapons in the hands of an enemy that had not yet arrived. Then I watched the king who had spent his life embodying the unity of his people fall because that unity was gone, only to rise again, bearing its absence as the very essence of his corruption. If the reader remembers nothing else from this appendix, remember this. The undead did not destroy Skoldvidar while it was whole. They never had the opportunity. Doubt reached the kingdom first, entered without breaking a gate, passed freely between Renoria's soldiers and Ingvar's first humans, emptied homes without setting them aflame, diminished armies without fighting them, and turned friends into factions before the first corpse marched across the northern frontier. The dead merely finished what the living had begun. King Ingvar Hafsson died because of that doubt, and death, in its cruelty, returned it to him as strength. Now, wherever the fallen king walks, the question that murdered Skoldvidar walks with him, waiting for another army to answer it incorrectly. And if ever you stand before him, do not ask whether you possess the strength to defeat King Ingvar Hafsson. Before you draw your sword, look instead upon those who came with you and ask yourself whether you trust them completely. If the answer does not come without hesitation, then Ingvar's corruption has already found its way inside your ranks, and somewhere beneath the ruined mountains of Skoldvidar, the old tragedy has begun again.